"You can't sit here," my sister snapped, her voice cutting through the restaurant like a knife. For a moment, the chatter around us faded. The clinking glasses, the laughter, the background music, it all dissolved into a dull hum as her words sank in. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, my pulse echoing in my ears. "Excuse me," I whispered, my voice trembling just enough to betray the shock that spread through me. Victoria rolled her eyes, her perfect red lips curling into that same condescending smile I'd seen all my life. "I said move," she repeated, her tone dripping with superiority. Her friends snickered, the sound sharp and deliberate, like they were all in on a joke I didn't understand. In that moment, I could feel every pair of eyes at the restaurant glance my way. The humiliation crept up my neck, hot and suffocating. My name is Evelyn Carter, and I'm the kind of person who doesn't forget moments like this. What Victoria didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that tonight, fate had already started rewriting the story. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or humiliated, stay with me, because what happens next will make you feel alive, furious, and strangely satisfied all at once. Growing up with Victoria was like living under a bright, blinding spotlight I could never step into. She was the golden child, effortless, charming, and always the center of attention. Our parents adored her in ways that left me feeling like I existed only in her shadow. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that my worth wasn't measured by applause or envy, but deep down, I felt the sting of being overlooked, of being invisible. Victoria never meant to be cruel most of the time. Her world was simply built around her, and everyone else, me included, was just part of the scenery. Victoria was beautiful in a way that made people forget to notice anyone else. Her long, blonde hair cascaded perfectly, her laughter was infectious, and she had a way of commanding a room without even trying. Meanwhile, I worked hard for everything, school, career, even friendships, always calculating, always observing, always trying to make my own mark. I was independent, yes, but independence didn't shield me from the subtle humiliations she tossed my way. At family gatherings, she would make offhand comments about my outfit, my job, my boring lifestyle. She didn't even need to be loud. A slight smirk, a glance, a dismissive word, enough to make me shrink inside. And yet, she never thought of these things as cruel. To her, it was simply her natural superiority shining through. I remember one Thanksgiving, everyone gathered in the grand dining hall, the air thick with laughter and clinking silverware. Victoria had invited her friends, models, influencers, people whose lives looked perfect in filtered photographs. As I passed the table with a tray of appetizers, she whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Try not to embarrass yourself tonight, Evelyn." My hands shook slightly, not from fear of her words, but from the sheer familiarity of being humiliated in front of everyone I knew. And it wasn't even the words themselves. It was that familiar, suffocating sense of invisibility. People laughed at her jokes, not noticing how I'd worked tirelessly behind the scenes, or how my efforts had been responsible for making the evening perfect. I've always been empathetic, always the kind of person who notices the small things, the quiet struggles. I could see the fatigue in the waitress's eyes, the way the janitor carried his heavy load without complaint, the little victories in people's daily lives. It made me painfully aware of injustice in all its forms, even the personal kind that Victoria dealt so freely. I learned to be observant, to read people's intentions, and to hide my own emotions carefully, because showing anger or hurt would only give her ammunition. I became strategic without even realizing it, quietly mapping out every moment, every slight, every injustice, storing it like a collection of fragile glass figurines, waiting for the right time to set them down and let them shatter. And maybe that's when the thought first came to me, not revenge in its obvious, childish form, but a kind of elegant justice, a statement that would be felt without ever being shouted. I wanted her to see that power isn't just about money, or status, or attention. It's about awareness, about influence, about knowing how to move the world subtly so that even the arrogant realize they're not untouchable. I couldn't yet see the full plan, but the seed had been planted, and it felt intoxicating. People think wealth makes you untouchable, I whispered to myself one afternoon, watching Victoria laugh at some joke I wasn't in, her head thrown back with that self-satisfied glow she always carried. They couldn't be more wrong. I felt a quiet smile tug at the corner of my lips. This time I decided I wouldn't be the shadow. I wouldn't let her casual cruelties define my story. No, the next chapter would be mine, and she would feel it in ways she would never see coming. Even now, when I think back, I can feel the tension between us like a live wire, ready to snap. But beneath that tension was something else. Clarity. Years of being underestimated had taught me more than anger could ever teach. It had taught me patience, observation, and the subtle art of influence. And patience, I reminded myself, was a far more dangerous weapon than any temper. "You can't sit here," Victoria's voice rang again, sharper this time, cutting through the low hum of conversation in the restaurant. I felt my face flush, not just with embarrassment, but with a surge of disbelief. The place was upscale, crystal chandeliers glinting overhead, polished mahogany tables, a soft string quartet playing in the corner, and here she was, making a scene like a child denied a toy. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady myself. "Victoria, please," I said softly, almost pleading. But my words fell on deaf ears. She turned to the maitre d' with a perfectly rehearsed sigh, her eyes rolling like storm clouds. "Make sure she doesn't stay here," she whispered, and the man gave an apologetic nod, as if my presence was a minor inconvenience to be managed. Every eye in the restaurant now seemed to find me. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, the uncomfortable awareness that strangers were watching, judging, some whispering to their companions. I tried to shrink into myself, to become invisible, but invisibility was impossible when your own sister was actively conspiring to humiliate you. The sting of betrayal was sharper than anything I'd expected. Victoria leaned back in her chair, sipping her wine with a practiced elegance that had always defined her. Her smile was perfectly composed, but her eyes glinted with amusement at my discomfort. She had no idea how long I'd endured moments like this, little knives hidden in words, gestures, and the unspoken hierarchy she enforced around her like a queen in a palace. And yet, something inside me refused to break. As I slowly pushed back my chair, the floor beneath my heels making that subtle scrape against the polished wood, I realized how calculated I had to be. I couldn't let her see the storm brewing inside me. Every pulse of anger, every pang of humiliation had to be contained. If I lost my composure, if I reacted, it would be her victory. "You can humiliate me, Victoria, but watch how this story ends. This is not over," I whispered under my breath, a quiet vow that no one else would hear, except maybe the universe itself. The staff, those quiet observers in the background, noticed the tension. The young waiter, polite and discreet, lingered near our table, his hands folded, as if he sensed the silent war unfolding. The hostess glanced in my direction, offering a sympathetic smile that warmed something deep in my chest. It was a subtle reminder that kindness existed in small gestures, even amid public embarrassment. Victoria wasn't finished. Her comments grew sharper, louder, designed to elicit attention. "Honestly, Evelyn," she said, her tone dripping with mock concern, "some people just don't know how to behave in fine places." Laughter followed, soft, knowing, from the circle of her friends. I felt every eye on me, every whispered judgment, every assumption about who I was and what I deserved. My stomach twisted, a cocktail of anger, disbelief, and humiliation. The music continued in the background, soft and oblivious to the drama unfolding, the violinists bowed dancing across strings, punctuating each moment like a subtle metronome to my growing fury. I noticed the reflection of myself in the polished silverware, my hands gripping the table edge, my knuckles pale, my eyes burning with contained fire. I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to demand that the world see her cruelty, but I didn't. I would not give her the satisfaction. Instead, I smiled, just a fraction, enough to seem polite, and stood up slowly. Each movement measured, calm, deliberate. The other diners didn't notice me leave. Victoria's laughter and chatter masked my departure. The staff held the door for me, their eyes lingering with that same quiet empathy. I caught a few smiles, genuine and unguarded, and something inside me shifted. It was as if the world had subtly whispered, "You're not alone." As I walked out, the crisp air of the evening brushing against my face, I glanced back. Victoria was still animated, still performing, still believing herself untouchable. But the staff, those who had witnessed the silent humiliation, who had seen her arrogance firsthand, had earned a small but undeniable ally in me. Their polite smiles, the tiny gestures of acknowledgement, planted a seed in my mind. I didn't yet know the shape it would take, but I felt it crystallizing, a plan forming with quiet precision. It wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be messy, but it would be unforgettable. Victoria's arrogance would meet an invisible mirror of her own making, a reflection of what it felt like to be powerless while someone else held the strings. "You can humiliate me, Victoria, but watch how this story ends." "This is not over," I murmured again, this time letting it linger, tasting it on my tongue like a promise. Each step away from the restaurant solidified my resolve. The world had shifted. I was no longer just the sister who followed in her shadow. I was the one who saw clearly, who felt deeply, and who understood that patience and observation could wield a power far more devastating than words ever could. And so I left, almost unnoticed, but every heartbeat was a drumbeat of strategy. I had seen the cracks, the quiet kindness in others, the small victories that would fuel what was coming next. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. After I left the restaurant that evening, the city lights reflected in the puddles along the sidewalk like shards of glass, fractured and glimmering. Every step I took felt heavy with thought, yet light with an almost imperceptible thrill. I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't let Victoria's arrogance go unanswered. But this wasn't about anger in the raw, explosive sense. No, this had to be elegant, subtle, poetic in its execution. I went home and sat in my small, minimalist apartment, the kind I'd built with years of hard work and quiet determination. My finances were my fortress. I didn't have a trust fund, I didn't inherit wealth, but I had independence, a sense of control, and resources Victoria could never imagine. I poured a glass of wine and began to map out a plan. Not violent, not reckless. I wanted her lesson to be felt with precision, not brute force. Step 1 was understanding the landscape. I started by researching the restaurant in painstaking detail. I learned about the staff, their shifts, their personalities. I studied the management, noting who had autonomy, who could implement something discreetly, and who would follow instructions without questioning. I read reviews from customers, noticing subtle complaints and praises. Each piece of information was a brushstroke, painting a clearer picture of how to make an impact without leaving a trace. Step 2 was psychology. I remembered the way Victoria behaved when she believed she had power, when she thought everyone existed only to validate her self-image. I had to leverage that. I thought about the moments from my childhood, the holidays ruined by her tantrums, the casual cruelty masked as jokes, the way our parents unknowingly reinforced her dominance. Every insult, every belittling glance, every whispered comment she made about my shortcomings became raw material for the plan forming in my mind. I didn't dwell on revenge in the simplistic sense. Revenge was about balance, justice, and subtle teaching. I imagined leaving something behind that would transform the staff's experience, elevate them, and indirectly remind Victoria that the world wasn't hers to control. I envisioned the surprise on their faces, the gratitude in their eyes. That alone filled me with a strange exhilaration. "It's not about money," I whispered to myself at one point, staring at my reflection in the window, the city lights stretching behind me. "It's about making someone who thinks they're untouchable see they were wrong." The thought warmed me like fire, and yet a pang of moral hesitation tugged at my conscience. Could I do this without crossing a line? Could I assert my dignity and still remain principled? These were questions I considered carefully, because revenge that compromises the self is not revenge, it's just another loss. I began to outline the mechanics of my plan. It had to be flawless, seamless, and nearly invisible. First, I needed to re-enter the restaurant without raising suspicion. I would need the staff to recognize me as a customer, not as the woman they had seen being dismissed and humiliated. I would prepare a gesture that would change their evening, something that would ripple through their lives without ever alerting Victoria to my hand. The more I considered it, the more poetic the plan became. Financially, I had the ability to make a statement that was meaningful yet discreet. I could leave enough that it would impact lives significantly, but not draw attention. I researched the best ways to transfer funds, consulted discreetly with financial advisors, and even considered leaving a note that encouraged the staff to celebrate themselves. I wanted it to feel like an invisible gift, an acknowledgement of their dignity, their humanity. As I organized the logistics, memories from the past kept surfacing. I remembered my 16th birthday, Victoria cutting the cake with her friends while I quietly handed out invitations to family members who barely noticed me. I remembered every holiday gathering where she stole the spotlight, every time she whispered some cutting remark behind a veil of charm. I relived the humiliation, but now I processed it through the lens of strategy rather than pain. Anger fueled the plan, but it was disciplined, directed, and purposeful. The suspense built within me as I calculated each step. Timing would be critical. The staff needed to be present, the restaurant not too crowded, and Victoria distracted in the background. I planned contingencies for every scenario. What if a manager questioned the generosity? What if Victoria's friends noticed something unusual? I considered every variable, noting the emotional and practical impact. Each possibility was a layer of armor around my plan, ensuring it could succeed without risk of exposure. By the time midnight rolled around, I had a comprehensive blueprint. I had studied the restaurant's layout, identified the staff I wanted to interact with, determined the precise moment for maximum effect, and even scripted the tone of my approach in my mind. Every detail had been considered. Yet, beneath the meticulous planning, there was a quiet thrill, a sense of freedom. For the first time, I felt fully in control. Patience is a weapon, I reminded myself later that night, tracing the rim of my wine glass. And I've been sharpening mine for years. Years of being overlooked, underestimated, and humiliated had honed me into someone who could act with both precision and restraint. I had learned the art of waiting, of observing quietly, and then striking at the perfect moment with subtlety. Victoria would not anticipate this. She could never anticipate it. And that was the beauty of it. The more I envisioned the scene, the staff's faces lighting up, the discreet acknowledgement of their hard work, the invisible ripple of gratitude, the more the plan crystallized in my mind. It was clever, socially poetic, and completely untraceable. I would be a shadow, an invisible benefactor, leaving behind a moment of joy and empowerment that Victoria could never touch. And yet, the emotional satisfaction would be mine. Late into the night, I revisited my memories, each one sharpening my resolve. I recalled every small humiliation, every whispered insult, every glance of dismissal. They were no longer wounds. They were raw materials, tools to shape a graceful, elegant justice. My anger had been tempered with strategy, my humiliation transformed into meticulous action. By morning, I was ready, not just to execute a plan, but to reclaim a sense of dignity I had long been denied. The anticipation was almost intoxicating. I imagined walking into the restaurant, blending in perfectly, offering warmth to the staff, and leaving them with a gesture so profound that it would linger in their memories long after I was gone. Victoria would be there, performing her usual spectacle, completely unaware that she had just witnessed the quiet, unstoppable assertion of my power. And in that moment, I realized, revenge isn't always loud. It doesn't have to scream. Sometimes, the most effective revenge is the one that arrives like a whisper, precise and unforgettable. My plan was no longer a fantasy. It was imminent, and it would unfold with elegance, discretion, and a satisfaction that raw anger could never provide. I walked into the restaurant like any other guest. No drama, no exaggerated sighs, no calling attention to myself. I'd traded my usual tailored coat for something softer, an oversized cashmere scarf, a low bun, glasses with plain frames. The disguise wasn't about hiding who I was from everyone. It was about dissolving the idea that I was anyone worth noticing. Blending in was an art I'd been practicing my whole life. It felt oddly liberating to be plain after years of being compared to Victoria's polished perfection. I paused for a breath at the entrance, feeling the same warm hush of the dining room settle over me, the soft chatter, the clink of glass, the low pulse of the string quartet in the corner. It smelled of lemon oil and rosemary, comforting, human. For a moment I just watched, absorbing everything I had catalogued in my plans, the hostess's polite smile, the waiter who always kept his back straight, the manager whose eyes flicked between tables like a careful hawk. I asked for a table in the corner, Nothing fancy, the kind of table that offered a good vantage point without being on display. The staff led me there with the same courteous efficiency they gave every patron. I ordered a small, unremarkable dish and a cup of tea. I could have reserved a private room, orchestrated a spectacle, but subtlety was the point. My presence had to be unremarkable so the gesture I would leave behind could land like thunder without warning. As I waited, I let my eyes roam and catalog people as if I were seeing them for the first time. The busboy with flour on his sleeve, the hostess whose posture hinted at exhaustion, the chef peeking out to taste a sauce, the head waiter whose smile was a practiced, kind mask. These were the people who kept the place alive, the invisible engines behind every polished plate. I felt my chest tighten with an odd, fierce affection for them. When the waiter came, I made sure our exchange was warm and genuine. I asked about his day, complimented the kitchen, and listened when he told me about his daughter's school recital. I paid attention to names, to details. He smiled in a way that told me he'd been seen, that small crack of sunlight that comes when someone acknowledges you beyond the role you perform. I left a modest tip on the table after the meal, the kind of polite gratuity one leaves without thought. Then, when I rose to leave, I stopped by the manager's station and asked to speak privately, lower voice, casual tone. I told him I wanted to do something special tonight for his staff. No publicity, no strings attached. He blinked, surprised, perhaps even suspicious, but he listened. We spoke quietly about who might be on the floor that night, about how best to ensure the money would reach those who worked the hardest, and about keeping the matter discreet so it would blur into the evening like a secret kindness. I'd arranged more than just an envelope. I'd arranged for an anonymous transfer that looked like a large but unremarkable donation to staff accounts, routed through a trustee service I used for charity work, methods I'd learned over the years of managing my own finances. I requested it be divided fairly, with a few discretionary pots for emergencies and a portion set aside for a communal celebration. I wanted them to have something to spend on themselves, dinners, school supplies, an evening out without counting change. I wanted it to feel like a bright, bewildering gift from the universe, not a performance. When the manager nodded and took my instructions, I felt the first real rush of the plan coming alive. It was strangely intimate, sort of like whispering a prayer and watching the first ripple skim the water. As the evening progressed, I kept my composure, savoring small moments. The waiter who came by with an extra amuse-bouche because the kitchen wanted to share, the hostess smoothing a napkin for a nervous couple, the line cook sending a wink toward the dining room. I let the scene play out, an audience to the theater of ordinary life. At a certain point, I excused myself to the restroom and left the envelope with a handwritten note for the manager. Nothing excessive, just a few lines about gratitude and an encouragement to use the money freely. I watched through the mirror as the manager read the note, his eyebrows lifting, his lips forming a small, startled smile. He didn't look at me with suspicion. He looked at me with an understanding that took my breath away, as if I'd given him permission to accept that kindness on someone else's behalf. I slipped back into my seat and watched the clock with deliberate calm. My chest felt taut with anticipation, but I held my breathing steady. If the plan was a chord, this was the moment to let it sound. At precisely the point I had arranged, when a lull spread over the dining room and many of the staff had a moment near the pass, the manager leaned closer to a small group of servers and began to speak in low, urgent tones. I watched their expressions change from routine to puzzled to incredulous to the kind of wonder that fully opened up a person. Eyes widened. Hands flew to mouths. One of the line cooks laughed, a hot, incredulous laugh that sounded like someone waking up. Then the way they reacted became a mirror I could not tear my eyes from. A server I had spoken with earlier, a young man named Daniel, stared at his phone, then at the manager, then at me with a look that punched through my chest. He mouthed a thank you that I never intended to receive but silently accepted. Another of the servers, a woman with tired eyes named Marisol, had to steady herself on a chair, tears gathering at the corners of her smile. "We can finally fix the brakes on the car," she whispered to the woman beside her, a private confession that sent warmth through me like a hand on the back. The head waiter, ever composed, excused himself for a second, and when he returned, there was a softness to his movement that hadn't been there before. Their gratitude was not theatrical. It was raw, human, immediate. From the corner of my eye, I caught Victoria. She had come with her usual entourage, sumptuous and luminous, and she was doing what she did best, holding court, punctuating sentences with trained laughter. She glanced over once, caught my figure in the corner, and for a beat seemed to register me. I saw something like recognition, then curiosity, then annoyance, an almost animal twitch of the brow that said, "Who is she now?" But instead of focusing on me, Victoria shrugged and turned away, assuming she understood the moment without actually seeing it. She would never have considered that the act unfolding would be for the people she ignored, not for her. At 26 minutes into the evening, as the staff clustered together, exchanging tentative smiles and awkward hugs, I felt a strange, powerful truth settle over me. Revenge isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes, it's about changing the game entirely. The line between satisfaction and vindictiveness had thinned into something purer, justice served quietly, with dignity. I sat back and let the feeling wash through me, not a gloating high, but a calm, rooted sense of rightness that hummed in my bones. The manager approached my table briefly, not to thank me directly. He kept to his word about discretion, but to let me know everything had been handled as requested. He mouthed the word gracias with understated reverence, and I nodded. My pulse slowed, satisfaction settling into the spaces where humiliation had once lived. I had expected to feel triumph, perhaps a flicker of malice toward Victoria, but instead my emotions were steadier, cleaner. I thought of all the small cruelties she dealt me, the whispered jokes, the savvy dismissals. I thought of all that water under the bridge. I had not shouted at her. I had not humiliated her in return. I had redirected my energy toward those who deserved the attention. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, word had wound through the floor staff like warm light through glass. They began to gather discreetly, passing knowing looks. Daniel came by with a half-hearted attempt at nonchalance and set down a cup of coffee with a tremulous hand. "No charge," he said, voice thick, though he tried to keep it light. "Kitchen's on me tonight." Marisol found me on the way out, and, with a courage that made my throat tight, she reached out and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said simply, the words heavy and elemental. I told her she was welcome and meant it, and in that exchange there was a binding of human dignity that felt more potent than anything I'd imagined. At 30 minutes, as Victoria laughed at a story one of her friends told, I allowed myself a quiet, private thought that felt almost mischievous. Victoria won't see it coming. But she'll feel it. In her pride. She would notice the small shifts, the softer attention the staff gave her, the way someone might later mention how kind the restaurant had been that night, the rumor that would unfurl slowly about an anonymous gift. It wouldn't be a public shaming, but it would be a recalibration. She would feel, without directly knowing, that the world could be generous without her consent. That knowledge would disturb her more than any scene I could have made. I left without creating a spectacle. My scarf tucked neatly under my coat, glasses slipping back into place, I walked through the same doors as before, this time holding a different air, lighter, steadier. Outside, the night had cooled and the streetlights threw long, forgiving shadows. I paused for a second to let the scene sit in my bones. The warmth behind the windows, the muted laughter that signaled ordinary lives carrying on, the knowledge that I had altered someone's evening in a way that would ripple outward. The satisfaction I felt was not cruel. It was restorative. I had reclaimed dignity for myself by giving dignity to others. In the days that followed, rumors drifted through social circles, soft, untraceable whispers about an anonymous benefactor who had changed a group of people's lives for the better. Victoria scanned the gossip with practiced disinterest, but I saw the way her jaw tightened when she heard stories of the staff celebrating on a rare night out. She tried to pin it to charity or to some glossy PR stunt, but the idea that anyone could act with such quiet generosity without seeking the spotlight unsettled her. That, more than anything, was my quiet triumph. I had set out to make a point, to remind a woman who had treated me like furniture that power also resides in humility and kindness. I had not sought revenge that would wound me back. I had sought a correction, graceful and irrevocable. Standing back from the scene, I understood that the strongest statements are often the ones you don't shout. They are the ones you craft with care, the ones that lift others, and in doing so, lift yourself. The days after that evening passed in a strange blur, as if the city itself had shifted subtly around me. I kept replaying the moments in my mind, the staff's astonished faces, the whispered words of gratitude, the quiet awe that lingered long after I had walked away. I had anticipated satisfaction, yes, but what I hadn't predicted was how cleansing it would feel. Relief rolled over me like warm water, washing away years of humiliation, anger, and the invisible weight of being dismissed. There was a tinge of guilt, of course, the kind that comes from knowing you've disrupted someone else's world, even if it's in service of justice. But that guilt was fleeting, tempered by the knowledge that every action had been thoughtful, intentional, and meaningful. I had chosen generosity over revenge, subtlety over spectacle, and in doing so, I had reclaimed a part of myself I didn't know I'd lost. The staff's reactions continued to reach me, even indirectly. Daniel, the young waiter I had spoken with, sent a brief message through the restaurant's general email thanking me, not for the money itself, but for the acknowledgement of their work, for the kindness that treated them as human beings rather than cogs in a machine. Marisol, the exhausted server with the tired eyes, later posted on a private staff group, "Last night was unreal. Someone saw us. Truly saw us." Even the manager, discreet and professional, found ways to express his gratitude without violating the anonymity I requested. Each response carved a sense of warmth into my chest, a reminder that impact isn't always measured by applause or recognition. I reflected often on the strange duality of the act. There was the relief, the catharsis, the joy of watching the people who served unnoticed for so long suddenly feel visible. And then there was the quiet thrill of subtle poetic justice. Victoria, oblivious as always to the undercurrents of life that didn't revolve around her, was left to process a world that didn't bend to her whims. She would feel the shift, even if she could never name its source. That, I realized, was more satisfying than confrontation, more powerful than any scene I could have staged in the restaurant itself. At 36 minutes into my mental replay of the event, I caught myself smiling at the memory of handing the envelope to the manager, the note inside simple yet intentional. I didn't just leave money. I left dignity, respect, and a lesson that money alone can't buy kindness. The thought reverberated through me, a quiet bell of satisfaction. I had given the staff not a handout, but acknowledgement, a validation of their humanity that no amount of money or privilege could ever replace. I had shifted the narrative, and in doing so, shifted my own. Victoria, of course, noticed something was different, but she couldn't quite place it. A few days later, at a family dinner she had insisted I attend, she tried to corner me in a moment of feigned casualness. "Evelyn," she said, leaning in with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "what have you been up to lately? Something tells me you're hiding a little scheme." Her tone was playful, but there was an undercurrent of suspicion that made me tense ever so slightly. I met her gaze evenly, letting a calm, measured expression settle across my features. "I've been busy," I replied lightly, the words innocuous, designed to reveal nothing. And then I let her fester in her own frustration. Victoria, used to controlling every interaction, quickly realized that her usual tactics, mockery, charm, overconfidence, had no effect. There was no opening for her to assert dominance, no way to make me squirm as she had done countless times in the past. That alone was a kind of sweet, quiet justice. She had no idea what had occurred at the restaurant, yet she instinctively felt that something was different. Her arrogance, normally so self-sustaining, had met an invisible wall. In the days that followed, whispers reached her from mutual acquaintances who had noticed subtle changes at the restaurant, the staff more confident, more jovial, and oddly empowered. Victoria tried to downplay it, but the ripple of curiosity and admiration was undeniable. She could see the result but not the architect, and that ambiguity gnawed at her. For someone who thrived on visibility and recognition, not knowing who had orchestrated such a shift was worse than any public embarrassment I could have inflicted. Some lessons, I thought, hurt more when you don't even see them coming. As I walked through my own life in the aftermath, I began to notice the quiet liberation in my own movements. I held my head higher, not in arrogance, but in recognition of self-worth. Every decision I made, every interaction I had, felt lighter. The energy that had once been consumed by resentment and the need for validation was redirected into observation, empathy, and the quiet satisfaction of having acted with intention. I realized that true power is not always loud. It is patient, deliberate, and invisible until it manifests in a way that can't be ignored. I thought often of the staff, picturing them recounting the night to each other in hushed tones, their faces lighting up as they remembered the surprise. I imagined Daniel telling his daughter about the unexpected kindness, Marisol sharing the story with friends who had long dismissed their labor, and even the manager recounting the incident in a quiet pride that never needed applause. Each imagined retelling sent a wave of warmth through me, a validation that the act of giving can be far more powerful than the act of punishing. There was also a quiet, almost imperceptible pride in how I had handled Victoria. I had not screamed, not humiliated, not made a scene. She was left to wrestle with the consequences of her own arrogance, while I moved forward with dignity. I understood in that moment that winning morally and socially does not require raising your voice. It requires presence, strategy, and restraint. The lesson Victoria had learned, or at least the ripple of it she felt, was permanent precisely because she didn't recognize the teacher. I revisited the memories late at night, alone in my apartment, reflecting on the mix of emotions: relief, pride, satisfaction, and just a hint of the lingering twinge that comes from knowing one has been clever. It wasn't guilt in the conventional sense. It was a moral awareness that my action had shifted lives, including my own. I felt a calm exhilaration that only comes from knowing you acted intentionally, with both compassion and strategic insight. The lines between righting wrongs and claiming personal justice had blurred beautifully, and the result was far more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. By the end of that week, the staff at the restaurant had begun to notice subtle improvements in their own morale, in their confidence, in the way customers responded to them. Small victories multiplied: a shared laugh, a sincere compliment, the recognition that their work mattered. I felt as though I had contributed to that quietly, invisibly, without ever needing to stand on a podium and claim credit. That, I realized, was the true triumph. And so I moved through my own days with a sense of moral victory. I didn't need to relive the humiliation Victoria had once inflicted. I didn't need to orchestrate grandiose scenes or wield cruelty as a weapon. My satisfaction was in the subtlety, in the ripple effect, in the knowledge that kindness, intelligence, and careful strategy could accomplish far more than aggression ever could. The echoes of that night remained with me in quiet ways: a grateful message from Daniel, a knowing smile from Marisol, a brief nod from the manager. Each was a reminder that the best acts of influence are not loud, not boastful. They are deliberate, thoughtful, and transformative. I had claimed my moment of justice, and in doing so, had discovered a new kind of power, one rooted in empathy, observation, and unwavering calm. In the quiet hours after everything had unfolded, I found myself thinking about the patterns of my life, the subtle ways family, upbringing, and circumstance shape who we become. Victoria had always been the loudest, brightest, most visible force in our shared universe, and I had spent years orbiting her gravity, trying to carve out a place where I might be seen. I had worked tirelessly, quietly, forging independence and self-reliance while she claimed attention without effort. And yet, there had always been a tension, a quiet weighing of value that was unspoken but deeply felt. That night at the restaurant crystallized something profound. My worth was not determined by someone else's perception, and the power of observation, patience, and thoughtful action could far outweigh any public performance. I realized that my journey towards self-worth had been a mosaic of experiences. Each slight, each small humiliation, each subtle dismissal by Victoria had become a building block for resilience. My empathy, once a source of vulnerability, had transformed into an instrument of clarity. I could see the unspoken needs of people around me, and I could act with intention. That evening, the way the staff responded to the unexpected gift reminded me how simple acts of recognition, kindness, and generosity can ripple far beyond their immediate context. I had orchestrated a moment that altered lives, not through spectacle, not through shouting, but through quiet, deliberate impact. Reflecting on the power of quiet revenge, I understood that it wasn't about punishment in the conventional sense. It wasn't about humiliation, confrontation, or even moral superiority. It was about balance, about restoring dignity where it had been overlooked, about asserting self-worth in a way that felt graceful rather than aggressive. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is the one that leaves no scars on you. That thought alone resonated with me, echoing through the corners of my mind with a sense of calm triumph. I had won, not by fighting, but by being strategic, empathetic, and patient. Victoria, I thought, had been so accustomed to being untouchable that she had never learned to notice the quiet forces around her, the unacknowledged effort of others, the invisible acts that sustain a world she takes for granted. That night, she had felt the ripples of consequence without ever identifying their source. It was a lesson delivered without malice, without exposure, and yet it was indelible. Arrogance, I realized, has limits, and sometimes it is the invisible currents, the subtleties of influence, integrity, and empathy that carry the most weight. I reflected on family, too, and the way patterns repeat across generations. Our parents, unwittingly, had reinforced Victoria's confidence and charm while neglecting to nurture mine in ways that felt visible. But the lesson I drew from that was not bitterness, it was empowerment. We cannot control how others behave, but we can control our response, our strategy, our agency. I had transformed a moment of humiliation into a triumph that elevated not just myself but others as well. That, I realized, was the core of true power, the ability to act with intention and leave a positive imprint without compromise. There was also a sense of liberation in observing Victoria from a distance afterward. I no longer needed to compete with her for recognition, nor did I need her approval. Her world was hers, and my world, quiet, deliberate, and morally intact, was mine. I thought about the whispers and the subtle changes that would occur in her perception, the awareness that something beyond her control had taken place. I didn't need to shout it from the rooftops. The lesson would settle in her consciousness over time, a subtle hum of consequence she could not ignore. Empathy, I realized, is often misunderstood as weakness. It is not. Empathy gives perspective, and perspective allows for precision. I had wielded it not to dominate or humiliate, but to create change with intention. The staff's astonishment, their joy, their visible relief, all of it confirmed what I had intuited. The quiet actions, performed with care, can move mountains in ways brute force never could. I had learned to see the invisible, to recognize the overlooked, and to act in service of both justice and humanity. As I considered my own path, I understood that life is full of small, invisible victories. They rarely make headlines or attract applause, yet they define character and moral strength. Victoria had relied on visibility, charm, and outward dominance to assert herself. I had relied on strategy, patience, and empathy. And in the end, those qualities had been far more powerful. The satisfaction I felt was not just personal, it was philosophical. It was the quiet affirmation that one can achieve influence without cruelty, assert self-worth without aggression, and correct imbalance without compromise. I also thought about the broader message, the subtle warning woven into my actions for anyone like Victoria. Arrogance, unchecked pride, and the assumption that one's status shields them from consequence are dangerous illusions. They blind a person to the power of discretion, observation, and patience in others. One can dominate a room, command attention, and charm a crowd, but if one underestimates the quiet, intelligent forces around them, their apparent invincibility can be undone without ever making a sound. That truth lingered in my mind with a quiet satisfaction. In reflecting on my own transformation, I realized that the act of planning and executing the evening's subtle intervention had not only been about justice but about reclamation. I had reclaimed my dignity, my sense of agency, and my belief in the possibility of impact without theatrics. The relief and catharsis were profound, layered with the subtle thrill of cleverness and foresight. I felt an odd combination of humility and quiet pride, a recognition that the greatest power often lies in patience, observation, and moral clarity rather than confrontation or spectacle. I spent hours imagining the staff recounting the evening to each other, smiles spreading across their faces as they relived the moment of surprise, the feeling of acknowledgement, the sudden weight lifted from daily burdens. Each imagined reaction reinforced my belief that true influence is invisible yet transformative. The moral and emotional power of the act lingered like a low, steady hum, resonating with the notion that subtle, thoughtful interventions can leave deeper marks than loud, aggressive actions ever could. And then, inevitably, I returned to thoughts of Victoria, as one cannot help but reflect on those who shaped the circumstances of one's decisions. She would continue her routines, unaware of the deliberate correction that had occurred under her radar. But I knew, in some corner of her consciousness, the shift had been registered. She had encountered an outcome she could not manipulate, control, or predict, a reality where her assumptions about power, attention, and influence were subtly, but irreversibly, challenged. I did not gloat. I merely noted the poetic symmetry with satisfaction. By the end of those reflections, I felt an extraordinary sense of completeness. Life had offered me a moment of validation, an opportunity to act with strategy, grace, and empathy, and I had seized it fully. I had experienced the interplay of patience, observation, and moral courage in a way that confirmed my own growth, resilience, and ingenuity. There was no need for applause, no need for recognition, no need for confrontation. The act itself, and the ripples it created, were their own reward. In that quiet understanding, I found empowerment. I had witnessed the transformative potential of thoughtful action, of subtle intervention, and of acting with clarity and compassion. I realized that life rewards those who combine intelligence, empathy, and patience, not with public spectacle, but with quiet, indelible impact. That night, I had not only corrected a personal imbalance, but I had also asserted a profound truth about human dignity, kindness, and the power of invisible influence. I let myself smile at that thought, a full, unguarded expression that felt almost foreign after years of being overlooked. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is the one that leaves no scars on you. It is the act of reclaiming dignity, uplifting others, and asserting self-worth with intelligence, strategy, and empathy. It is the quiet, invisible hand that alters lives, shifts dynamics, and leaves a moral and emotional mark far deeper than any public spectacle could achieve. The night air hit me as I stepped out of the restaurant, crisp and liberating, carrying the faint scent of city lights and rain-washed streets. My steps were measured, calm, almost casual, but inside I felt a weight lift, a tension I hadn't even realized had lodged in my chest for years. Each footfall echoed a sense of quiet triumph, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand recognition, but settles deep in your bones. I could still feel the warm gratitude of the staff, the subtle flickers of astonishment that had spread across their faces like sunlight through clouds. That alone was enough to make every calculated moment worth it. From inside the restaurant, I saw the staff waving discreetly, their smiles genuine and unguarded. Daniel's eyes met mine, and he gave a subtle nod, a gesture of shared understanding. Marisol waved with a hand pressed to her heart, laughter dancing in her eyes, a mixture of disbelief and joy. Even the manager gave a curt, respectful bow of acknowledgement. None of them knew the full scope of what had happened, and that was exactly how I had intended it. Their delight, their validation, their sense of recognition was enough. It was silent, invisible, and entirely authentic, a true gift, and the sweetest kind of victory I could imagine. Victoria, across the room, remained unaware of the invisible currents swirling around her. Yet in her subtle gestures, the tightened jaw, the abrupt sip of wine, the flick of her gaze toward the staff, I could sense the confusion. Her carefully constructed world, one built on charm, wealth, and unchallenged attention, had encountered a reality she could neither control nor predict. It was poetic justice of the quietest, most effective sort. She had been humbled, though not loudly, not painfully, just enough for the realization to settle in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. As I walked down the street, the city seemed unusually vivid. Streetlights flickered against puddles, pedestrians moved with their own unseen rhythms, and yet I felt fully present, fully alive. There was no gloating in my heart, no lingering resentment, only a deep sense of satisfaction that comes from knowing you acted with intention, integrity, and intelligence. The humiliation Victoria had inflicted on me had been transformed into something far greater, an act of empowerment, both for the staff and for myself. I allowed myself to pause for a moment, taking in the scene, the quiet vibrancy of life moving around me. The street hummed softly, indifferent to the intricacies of my victory, but I felt the weight of my own achievement. Years of being dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated had culminated in this small, perfect symphony of subtle influence. No one had shouted, no one had cried, and yet the message had landed with precision. I had reclaimed my dignity, asserted my moral power, and, in the process, elevated others. That was the kind of triumph that resonates long after the moment has passed. As I continued walking, I reflected on the emotional landscape of the evening. Relief, catharsis, and a quiet thrill of cleverness intertwined, forming a sense of peace I had rarely known. My mind wandered to Victoria's bewilderment, to the subtle but undeniable shift in her awareness. She could not articulate it, and perhaps she never would, but the lesson had been delivered. Power without empathy is fragile, visibility without awareness is hollow, and arrogance without recognition of others is ultimately isolating. I felt no need for revenge in the conventional sense because the evening had provided a far richer, more satisfying resolution. And then I spoke quietly to myself, the words a reflection of everything I had experienced. So, if you've ever felt invisible, underestimated, or dismissed, remember, you always have a way to rise above. You don't need to hurt anyone, just be clever, kind, and fearless. Trust me, it feels better than revenge could ever promise. It was a mantra, a personal truth, and a message I imagined resonating beyond my own life. Every act of kindness, every calculated gesture of empowerment holds within it the ability to shift dynamics, alter perceptions, and restore balance without destruction. That, I realized, was the essence of true power. I thought back to the small moments in the restaurant, the flickers of understanding in the staff's eyes, the way gratitude spread through subtle smiles and quiet exclamations. Those moments were priceless, ephemeral, yet they left marks that would linger far longer than any shouted confrontation. The thrill of invisibility, of quietly orchestrating a moral victory without fanfare, was intoxicating. I felt a surge of joy not only for myself, but for every unseen person whose efforts and humanity I had acknowledged. Victoria would continue her life, undoubtedly unaware of the full impact of what had occurred. She would perceive nothing and yet feel the subtle tremor of consequence. That, I understood, was the most satisfying form of justice, invisible, untraceable, and moral. There was no need to watch her falter, no need to point or mock. She had already encountered the limits of her arrogance. The lesson had arrived silently, like a gust of wind shifting the leaves, leaving her to navigate a world she could no longer manipulate entirely. As I rounded the corner and entered the quieter streets, the peace within me deepened. My steps were lighter now, more confident, yet unassuming. The evening had not only altered the lives of those who served at the restaurant, but it also transformed my own sense of agency. I was no longer the shadowed sister, the overlooked observer. I was someone who had acted with strategy, intelligence, and empathy, and in doing so, had claimed victory in a way that left me unscathed. I allowed the warmth of the night to seep in, the subtle sounds of the city underscoring the internal harmony I had cultivated. Every flicker of neon, every distant laughter, Every pedestrian passing by was a reminder that life moves forward, indifferent to petty conflicts, and yet full of opportunities to act with intention. That understanding of agency within the flow of life filled me with an emotional resonance deeper than I could have anticipated. The moral of the evening crystallized with clarity. True power lies not in shouting, in commanding attention, or in seeking revenge. True power lies in patience, observation, empathy, and strategic kindness. It is the capacity to transform humiliation into empowerment, invisibility into influence, and subtle moments into lasting impact. That lesson, both for myself and for anyone paying attention, was immutable, and it carried a profound sense of freedom. And as the final minutes of the evening settled around me, I allowed one last thought to linger in the quiet of my mind, and that's the story of how a single moment of humiliation became the most unforgettable lesson of our lives. I smiled at the notion, not with vanity, but with an understanding of the depth of human resilience, the power of quiet influence, and the capacity for grace in the face of injustice. By the time I reached my apartment, the city lights reflected softly off the windows, illuminating a path forward that felt unburdened and clear. The staff had been seen, acknowledged, and uplifted. Victoria had encountered consequences, subtle yet effective, for her arrogance. And I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed, emotionally, morally, and strategically. I sank into my chair, reflecting on the emotional arc of the evening, the interplay of subtlety, empathy, and moral clarity. I realized, with a quiet smile, that empowerment is often silent, influence often unseen, and true justice rarely requires confrontation. Sometimes, the best victories are those that leave no scars but create lasting resonance, shaping the world in ways that are invisible to those who assume they control it. And in that understanding, I found an inner peace that was as profound as it was enduring. The lesson of that evening, crafted with patience, intelligence, and kindness, had become more than an act of quiet revenge. It had become a testament to dignity, empathy, and the transformative power of thoughtful action.